Hello and welcome to Time of Death. I'm Ris.
And I'm Dee.
And if you're new here, welcome. We are two nurses that love talking true crime. We like to focus on cases that have a heavy medical influence to them or cases that feature a medical professional as a perpetrator or victim.
Great. And tonight is night 2 of our week.
Back at it again.
My brain was fried today.
Last night, I feel like we were fried.
Fried, yes, last night. But my brain, my sense of humor is always intact. But my brain was completely, I said something. I was trying to say postmenopausal. We were talking about cyclical vomiting in women who have their period.
Mm-hmm. Oh.
And I ended up saying, well, in women that are postpartum, and I was talking about postmenopausal.
Oh. That's okay.
And I was like, took me like a good 2 minutes to realize my misstep.
Wait, people have cyclic vomiting during menopause or after menopause?
No, it's unusual. We were talking about this, but there's an association between cyclical vomiting and menstrual cycles.
Oh, okay. I just want to say really quick that the case we're going to be talking about today is an ongoing case. So the thoughts and opinions we're going to be sharing today is based on our own research. All right. So Ellen Greenburg was born on June 23rd, 1983 in New York City. She was the daughter of Josh and Sandy Greenberg. And Ellen received a communications degree from Penn State, and then she went on to continue her education at Temple University with the dreams of becoming a teacher. After this, Ellen started teaching first grade at Juniata Park Academy in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. She lived there with her fiance, Samuel Goldberg, and they lived in a quiet neighborhood called Manayunk. On January 26, 2011, 27-year-old Ellen was working when a blizzard overtook the area. Ellen left the school and went home for the day. It was around dinner time when her body was found. Samuel had come home from the gym, and when he tried to open the door, he discovered that it was dead-bolted. So he started calling Ellen repeatedly. He was calling, texting, and emailing her to get her to open the door. Among the texts, he wrote, "Hello, open the door. What are you doing? I'm getting pissed. Hello, you better have an excuse. What the F word? And you have no idea." After an hour, he decided to knock the door down, and then he walked in to see the body of his dead fiancé. She had 20 stab wounds. She had 10 to her back and neck, and she also had 11 various bruises. And these were on her right arm, right leg, and abdomen. And there was also a knife lodged into her chest. There was a half-made fruit salad on the counter, indicating that she was midway through the point of making a meal. Samuel called 911 at 6:33, and Ellen was pronounced dead 7 minutes later. And sadly, Ellen had just sent out save the dates for her wedding to Samuel. For some reason, police immediately believed it was a suicide, and it was treated as such.
Stabbing herself.
Yeah.
However many times.
20 times. And
in the back?
In the back, neck.
That's so
all over.
Wild.
So
She do it to her back.
She would have.
Self-inflicted.
She wouldn't have been able to.
Yeah.
So this becomes a huge point later on. So they think it's suicide, and during the autopsy, the medical examiner says it was a homicide. And the next day, police actually said that it had not been ruled a homicide. It just seemed like that the death was suspicious.
This smells like a cover-up.
Yeah, so that's the point later on. That's what the family brings up and it's still going on to this day. Apparently, there were some meetings done privately between the detectives and Osborne, and also Osborne's boss, the chief medical examiner, Sam Gulino. That happened in February, and then a couple months later, on April 4th, Osborne switched the cause of death from homicide to suicide. About a month and a half later, the Philadelphia Inquirer newspaper prints a front page report about Ellen's death, along with all the suspicious details of it. There was a lot of outcry saying, okay, this was clearly not a suicide. How can that even, happen? In addition to this, a couple well-known forensic experts voiced their opinions as well. One of these was Cyril Wecht, a forensic pathologist. He said that it was strongly suspicious of homicide and that he didn't know how it could have been passed off as a suicide. He said it is very, very likely that it was a homicide. Henry Lee, he is a forensic scientist. He said that the number and types of wounds and bloodstain patterns observed are consistent with a homicide scene. Some of Ellen's stab wounds occurred in the head, and they penetrated her brain.
How would someone do that to themselves and still be able to continue stabbing other parts of their body? Never mind the dexterity to stab themselves in the back. Never mind the blood loss. Makes no freaking sense.
Yeah, so the investigator, Wayne Ross, I'm not sure what his qualifications are, but he's saying that wounds to the brain and spinal cord obviously would have rendered severe pain, nervous system dysfunction, trauma to the brain. However, the original medical report said that these wounds never occurred. And they also included that a well-known neuropathologist named Lucy Balian Rourke Adams had verified the fact that there were none of these wounds. When asked later on, Lucy said that she didn't remember the case and that she never saw this person's brain. And there was also no record of a bill or invoice being paid to Lucy.
So someone fraudulently included her on there.
So this is kind of the thinking, is that it was kind of dropped in there as just to bolster the case. Another puzzling issue here is that police allowed the crime scene to be professionally cleaned prior to detectives arriving on scene with a search warrant. So supposedly while the autopsy was going on, the crime scene was being cleaned.
Something is rotten in Denmark.
Yeah. In addition to this, Samuel's uncle, a well-known judge in Pennsylvania named James Schwartzman, he was able actually to go into the apartment and remove some items, including Ellen's computer and her cell phone. Oh my God. And he later claims that police let him go in there. They were aware of why he went in and that he had taken these items. Also, just a side note here, Ellen is covered in bruises and they're all at different stages of healing.
Oh.
Indicating that she had gotten these bruises over a longer period.
That sounds very suspicious. And there's a lot of red flags.
So Ellen's dad later tells news sources that she was being abused. The bruises were consistent with abuse. He's fully convinced that she is going through abuse, at least physical abuse. Ellen was diagnosed with anxiety before her death by a psychiatrist named Dr. Ellen Berman. However, Dr. Berman denies that Ellen endorsed any suicidal thoughts. Ellen's family filed a civil suit against the medical examiner's office in Philadelphia and Marlon Osborne. He was the pathologist who completed Ellen's autopsy. So they filed this civil suit in 2019. They want the cause of death changed to homicide or even undetermined. They don't want
so.
They don't want it to just be suicide and just kind of, thrown out. Right. This case is still pending to change it to suicide 13 years later, or now almost 14 years later. Around this time, photogrammetry became possible, and this allows viewers to see a 3D anatomical recreation of all of Ellen's wounds. And by doing so, it was apparent that some of her stab wounds weren't possibly able to be self-inflicted. In 2022, the Greenbergs filed another lawsuit, and this is ongoing. They have accused officials involved of conspiring to cover up and of causing both of them emotional distress. They're saying, you guys grossly botched this investigation. On July 30th, 2024, the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania granted a petition for allowance of appeal to review the challenges to Ellen's cause of death. On December 11th, 2024, just a few weeks ago, oral arguments were heard where the Greenbergs accuse local officials in the medical examiner's office of covering up Ellen's death and taking part in a conspiracy to disguise Ellen's homicide as a suicide. The 4 defendants named in the lawsuit include Osborne, the pathologist who did the autopsy, former chief medical examiner Sam Gulino, retired homicide sergeant Tim Cooney, and a homicide detective named John McNamee. Samuel, Ellen's fiance, recently spoke up saying that he was bewildered after Ellen committed suicide, and he says, quote, "Unimaginably, in the years that have passed, I have had to endure the unimaginable passing of my future wife and the pathetic and despicable attempts to disarray my reputation and her privacy by creating a narrative that embraces lies, distortions, and falsehoods in order to avoid the truth. Mental illness is very real and has many victims." So he's saying she did kill herself, and he's saying that she was struggling with mental illness. From what I can see, this is what he's saying. And we know she has anxiety, but again, the psychiatrist that met with her and that, was her doctor denied, I mean, obviously things happen. You don't always know the full picture, even as a mental health professional, but there was no indication that she had any suicidal, ideation or thoughts or anything like that. Ellen's mom, Sandy, made a statement. "I feel like we're advocating for her. We are getting closer to justice for Ellen. We are very determined and not giving up." So the Greenbergs not only are still grieving over their loss, but they are also unable to move on until they get closure for their daughter, which is,
Understandably.
of course, very difficult.
I think the big takeaway is here, obviously, Samuel would be under a lot of suspicion because he is the partner. There's bruising, even the text messages that he sent, like, he didn't say, "Are you okay?"
Right.
Yeah.
Like, how did he not know that she had a medical emergency? Because if I wasn't answering my phone, and, like, I would like to think that someone, like my loved one, whether it's my fiance, sister, mom, whoever, brother,
Yeah.
that they would be like, okay, something's really wrong here. Like, we're going to call 911 and then they can come and respond.
Yeah.
It's not, I'm going to break down the freaking door.
Especially if I knew that they were home.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And they weren't answering me.
And to knock down the door.
Yeah.
I thought that was weird.
It's
I thought
super
I would-
weird.
I would have called 911 and said, something's not right. She's in there and see what, have a face to what they do.
Agatha Christie has a book in which there's a murder takes place inside a locked room. And so people figure, well, it has to be a suicide because this person was locked in the room. I feel like they kind of took a page out of that by locking the door from the inside, but that's not accounting for windows. There's probably more than one way to actually get into the home. I looked up the book, or the classic, Hercule Poirot must solve the case of a murdered man found with a gun in a locked room. This is a very similar situation, but it's a knife. So people are like, oh, well, it has to be a suicide if it was locked from the inside. Not true. Not true at all.
Was it a home or an apartment or what was it?
So they were living at the Venice Loft condominiums, and there was a gym in the apartment complex. That's where Samuel went to the gym, is inside the complex.
Oh, Sherlock Holmes, The Adventure of the Speckled Band. That's another. So this brings us, life really does imitate art. Because, as I'm sure that you all know, I'm a big Sherlock Holmes buff. And this was very reminiscent of the Speckled Band. Which, again, it's like the quintessential locked room mystery. Essentially, there's a death. And it's Julia Stoner. So essentially what happens in this case is a young woman, Julia, perishes in her room late at night after calling out a speckled band to her sister. And it's just like, what? The next morning is found dead. Come to find out, it was a venomous snake that had like crawled through the vents or something. And the speckled band that she screamed out again was referring to the poisonous snake, which was the most poisonous snake in India at the time. But the moral of the story, they find out it was a snake, they find out who did it, and, you know, ironically, the snake ends up biting and killing the person who used it to kill Julia.
Oh.
So maybe whoever killed Ellen may also find themselves at the end of a speckled band.
Speckled knife.
Did that sound mysterious enough?
So in the weeks leading up to Ellen's death, the Greenbergs are talking about how she had seen her psychiatrist and that she had been prescribed Zoloft and then low-dose Xanax and then prescribed Ambien and Klonopin when those didn't really do much for her. This was a report made by Dr. Wakedt. He's that pathologist that we talked about earlier that gave his input that it was definitely not a suicide. He thought it was definitely a homicide. And the Greenbergs, you know, clearly they don't believe that this was a suicide. They think it was nefarious. Joshua, Ellen's dad, he did point out that he did believe that there was an abusive component.
All right, Ris, great case. I love a good locked room mystery. I am terribly sad to hear about Ellen, and what happened to her. I hope that the family gets some answers. Very suspicious circumstances.
Yeah.
Very unfortunate and terribly sad circumstances. I don't know her. I can't speculate anything, but it's really sad when people's whether it's medical or mental health history are kind of used as a weapon. I think that's a really tragic, awful thing in itself.
Yeah.
If she hadn't seen a psychiatrist, would they have been saying that this was suicide, been so likely to label it as suicide? Who knows?
Yeah.
But just my 2 cents.
Yeah. I hope the family ultimately gets the closure that they need.
With some peace.
Yeah. And some peace, long-awaited peace. But we're going to wrap it up for tonight. The time is 18:30. That's 6:30 for those of you who do not use military time still. And we'll talk to you next week. Bye.
Bye.